Sometimes, the past can come back to haunt us, whether it be the memory of an embarrassing action or the regret of a harmful word spoken to another loved one. Although most of us do our best to move on from these experiences, sometimes they linger inside our minds, and sometimes the people who have harmed us can live on through our thoughts. This was the case for Donny Decker, although his past came back to haunt him in a more visceral way that I'm sure none of us would ever wish to experience. In Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, during the year 1983, a family underwent a life-altering experience. Don Decker, more widely known as Donny, had been sentenced to 1 to 2 years in prison for possession of stolen property. Donny wasn't a bad kid, but he had been mixed up with the wrong people. He was planning on quietly doing his time and getting his life back together. He hoped to be able to return to a normal life. As you can expect, this was not the case for Donny. Donny was introverted and quiet and didn't get up to much trouble once he was in prison. The warden regarded him as an unremarkable prisoner who seemed genuinely remorseful for his action. He kept his head down and focused on exhibiting good behavior. Donny had a troubled home life, to say the least. His mother wasn't very supportive of him growing up, and she was definitely not supportive of him now that he had gone to prison. She made it clear that he would not be welcomed back into her house after he had completed his prison sentence. All of this had led him to get involved with criminals. Donny didn't think of himself as a criminal, but he was willing to accept the consequences of his actions. For now, he was just focused on his life in prison and how he could make it as comfortable as possible for himself. During his prison stay, on account of his good behavior, Donny was granted a weekend pass so he could attend his grandfather's funeral. The prison determined that he was not a threat to society, so the idea of letting him out of his cell for a few days seemed reasonable enough. Although he was excited to be out of his cell and back into life outside, he was not thrilled at the idea of attending his grandfather's funeral. Donny claimed that his grandfather was a bad person, that he abused and hurt Donny as he was growing up. He had terrible memories of a terrible man, and he was still reeling from the horrors that his grandfather had put him through. Donny wasn't at the funeral to celebrate the life of his grandfather. He was there to be glad that his childhood demon had finally died. During this weekend trip, Donny was not welcomed back by his mother. She was still appalled at Donny's actions, and the rocky home environment that Donny grew up in was partly to blame for his crime. She would not let him stay in the house, and Donny had to find somewhere else to live. He called up one of his mother's coworkers, and she and her husband had offered to take him in as long as he needed. The Kiefer family was generous and forgiving of Donny's troubled past. They knew Don was a good kid at heart who had gotten caught up with the wrong crowd. Despite their faith in Donny's new, rehabilitated image, they were still worried for him. They knew that Don's relationship with his grandfather was a turbulent one. The generosity of the Kiefer family would lead them into a harrowing experience they would never forget. The first night of his stay at the Kiefer household, Donny went upstairs to wash up before dinner. He was grateful for the generosity of the family, and he knew he would be an inconvenience to them, but he was surprised at how determined they were to take good care of him over the weekend. While he was standing at the sink, he began to feel a sinister feeling come over him. He started to feel uneasy and this sick feeling filling his stomach. He felt a pressure around him that he wasn't able to explain by any natural means, and as he finished washing his hands, he felt the air go out of the room. Donny felt like he was in a vacuum. He couldn't breathe, and he started to panic. He started gasping for air, and the room went cold. For a brief moment, the air stood still. This silence didn't last long. As soon as he felt this unseen force start to attack him, Donny was scared and confused, his mind reeling from the invisible attack that he had just experienced. After another brief moment of quiet, the room came to life as the shower curtain flung itself open and the lights started to flicker. The cabinet swinging open and items from the shelves started tumbling to the ground. During this harrowing experience, Donny looked over towards the door and saw something he will never forget. In the shadows by the door, there was a face. the face of an old man, and on the man's head was a crown. Fear and pain shot through Donny's body as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Nothing like this had ever happened to him before, and as he was at a loss of what to think about this horrifying ordeal, the terror finally subsided after a few moments, and the face that he had seen was gone, and Donny was eager to get out of the bathroom and back into the company of other people. Donny caught his breath and calmed down. Looking down at the sink, he noticed something. There was blood dripping into the white porcelain bowl. He looked down at his hands and noticed there was 3 deep and distinct bloody marks on his wrist. They looked like claw marks. Donny didn't remember scratching his wrist, but the scratches were there and they were painful. As he examined the source of the blood, he felt scared. Donny had no idea how or why this was happening, and he knew that he would have a hard time explaining it to any rational human being. At this point, the Kiefer family had been waiting on Donny for a few moments. The father of the family sent his son up to go check on the guest they had taken in, and as the son called out for Donny decided that he didn't want to tell the family what had happened. He wasn't sure how he would even explain the terrifying experience if he wanted to. The Kiefer family was nice enough to take him in when no one else would, and he didn't want to start causing trouble for the family that believed in him when no one else did. When Donny came down for dinner, the father of the Kiefer family, Bob, noticed he looked strange. He could see Donny was pale and looked sickly, and could immediately tell that something was off about the boy they had taken in. As Donny reached to grab some food on the table, Bob saw the cuts on Donny's arm. He grabbed Donny's hand and saw the blood marks on his wrist. Understandably, Bob was worried that this was something Donny had done to himself. He asked Donny why he had hurt himself, and Donny responded slowly but passionately, "Bob, it wasn't me. There was something upstairs. I saw a man's face and he looked like the devil." Bob decided not to press Donny on the situation. While he knew that Donny was a good kid, he didn't know whether the boy was dealing with any mental issues, and seeing as Donny would only be there for the weekend, he didn't want to cause any problems. Dinner continued on with a tension hanging in the air that no member of the Kiefer family seemed eager to address. They carried on like nothing had happened, finished up like it was any other Saturday. Bob figured he could just let this slide, and there would be no more trouble during Donny's stay at the Kiefer's home. After dinner, the family gathered together in the living room. Bob believed Donny. He didn't think that Donny had hurt himself, but he still couldn't fully understand the situation. The mother of the Kiefer family started to fold laundry as the rest of the family gathered around the TV. Even with the shocking revelation of Donny's hurt arm, Bob was determined to make this evening just like any other. It wasn't long before things stray far from normal, however. As the family lounged around together, they started to feel a coldness take hold of the room. Although the entire family felt the cold, only Donny could recognize it as the same cold that had just filled the upstairs just a few hours earlier. Donny knew what was coming as he sat on the couch and stared down at his lap. The family sat in silence as dread and uncertainty filled the minds of everybody in the room. The mother turned to her husband and said, "Bob, I think we have a problem." She pointed to the wall of the living room, and Bob saw what his wife was referring to. There was water running down the wall of their living room. The immediate thought going through Bob's mind was that they had a leaking pipe. This would be a little inconvenience, but it was something he knew how to handle. As his mind started thinking about the pipes in the wall and how he would go about fixing them, a thought came to his mind. There's no water on that side of the house. There aren't even pipes in the wall that could be causing this leak, and upon realizing this, Bob walked towards the wall to inspect the problem further. As he touched the water, he noticed that there was something off about the liquid. The water, he felt, was sticky and viscous, and there was an indescribable otherworldliness to it. It wasn't water, or at least it wasn't like any water Bob had ever felt. Before they could process what they were seeing, the family heard a sound from upstairs. The sound was over too quickly for Bob and the others to identify it, but it was definitely not a normal sound. It almost sounded like a menacing growl, A pervasive sense of fear came over the entire family. The parents brought their kids into their arms. Although they had experienced some frightening phenomena, the strangest was yet to come. Out of nowhere, Bob started to feel drops on his head. He looked up and noticed there was water dropping everywhere in the family room. It was like it was raining inside the house. There was water forming in the air before his very eyes and falling onto the carpet. Bob composed himself as he tried to understand what was going on and looked at the stairs and shuddered at the thought of going to the second floor. Bob decided to call his landlord Ron. He didn't want to describe the problem to Ron because he knew that he would not believe him. Could you blame him? It's not every day that you have water pouring from your ceiling. The unexplainable rain continued until Ron and his wife got to the house. The landlord was at a loss for words. It wasn't raining outside currently, and it hadn't rained for weeks, so there couldn't be a leak in the roof. Ron suggested that he and Bob go upstairs to check on the problem, and Bob shuddered at this suggestion. He could still feel an uninviting presence coming from the upper level of the house, and he was not too keen on the idea of facing that presence head on. Bob composed himself and prepared to enter the upper level of the house. Although he was terrified, he knew that it was his responsibility to check on the house. Bob and Ron started to climb the stairs as Donny sat thinking about what he had just experienced. Donny knew there was an evil presence upstairs, and he was pretty certain that he knew what it was. Donny was sure that it was his grandfather coming back to hurt him. It all seemed to line up so perfectly. His grandfather was an evil man, and he knew he would be evil even after his time on Earth was over. When Bob and Ron made it upstairs, they both felt a feeling of dread come over them. They started inspecting the rooms of the upper level, looking for some sort of rational explanation to what they had seen. They looked at the room directly above the living room and determined that the water wasn't leaking from there. As the two men further inspected the upper floor of the house, they made their way into the bathroom where Donny was just attacked a few hours earlier. There was that same cold feeling they all had felt moments ago, coming from the room, and Bob felt that there was some sort of evil spirit in the bathroom. Although he could not see it, he knew something was up there with them. Something sinister was waiting for them. After the men completed their inspection of the upstairs, they headed back to the living room. It was still raining. Bob looked over at Donny, who was still sitting on the couch. He called out to Donny. No response. He called out again. Still no response. Bob could see that Donny, while physically in the room with him, was far removed from the current situation. He was there, but he wasn't there. Ron could feel a strange presence coming from Donny, and Donny felt as if he was going into a trance. All of a sudden, the strangest thing happened with the water in the room. It started rising from the floor and flying towards the ceiling. It was as if the rain was falling in reverse. Bob was at complete loss for what to do at this point. He looked at Ron and said that he would feel more comfortable if the police were involved. Ron agreed, so Bob picked up the phone, dialed 911. Stroudsburg was a small town, so the officer that answered the phone immediately recognized the voice of Bob Kiefer. The Kiefers were new in town, and the police officer knew that Bob was not the type of person to exaggerate his stories. When Bob explained the situation, the officer told him that he might be better off calling a plumber for his current problem. But Bob was insistent that the officer come to his house. The officer agreed and took a squad car down to the Kiefer residence. When the officer arrived, the family left the house immediately. As the officers went into the house, they felt the same cold feeling everybody else had felt in the living room. The police observed the same gravity-defying droplets coming from the floor. And as they stood there in shocked silence, the officers saw a droplet form in the air between them and shoot itself into the darkness. It was as if the drop was luring them further into the dark house. As the officers looked at the house, the Kiefers started to feel suspicious of Donny. The mother and Ron's wife cornered Donny, demanding answers from him. They accused him of causing the problem and demanded that he stop the rain. Donny was unresponsive, and he shrugged off the assault of words from the two women. As the woman laid into Donny with their words, something unexpected happened. The cupboards flung open and pots and pans crashed down to the floor, and during the chaos, the family could see that Donny was being raised into the air by some sort of force. As Donny struggled in the air, that same force flung him into the corner of the room. When he hit the floor, Donny came back to his senses. He knew that he had been attacked again, and he felt a familiar, sharp pain in his arm. He looked down and saw a crown carved into his arm, the same crown that he had seen on the man in the bathroom. At this point, the entire family was confused and shocked, while Bob and the others didn't know what was going on. They all knew that they were in the presence of pure evil. There was a demonic force at work in the Kiefer family house. Bob knew that there was some sort of demon in Donny, and Donny knew who it was. Donny knew he was possessed by the spirit of his recently deceased grandfather. At this point, Bob was at a loss for words. He was a religious man, so he grabbed his Bible. He handed it over to his wife, who began to read from it out loud. As his wife read from the Bible, to hopefully cast out its spirit that was in Donny, the water droplets in the room started turning their focus to her. Drops pelted Bob's wife as she continued reading. As the intensity in her voice grew, so did the intensity of the unexplained rain. It was as if the spirit in the house was attacking her through the raindrops. Rain pelted her as she read louder and louder to hopefully get through to Donny. And after she finished her reading, the rain stopped and there was finally a quiet silence in the house. At this point, Donny was back to being himself. He had experienced the same events that all the other people in the house did, but he wasn't quite conscious of it all. He said before it was like he was in a trance. He collected himself and stared at the rest of the family. He was at a loss for words. What could he even say to explain himself? He himself didn't even want to understand what was going on. He just hoped that the Kiefers wouldn't kick him to the curb as his own mother had done the day prior. The Kiefer family knew they had a problem on their hands. They had experienced unexplainable situations and they knew why it had happened. It was Donny. The mother of the family claimed that she knew there was no problem with their house. They had never experienced anything like that until they had accepted Donny into their home. They let Donny stay the rest of the weekend, and then they decided they would have the courtesy to take him back to jail. After all that they had experienced, they were eager to return to their normal lives. And soon, Donny's weekend pass expired and he was required to go back to jail. Bob dropped Donny off in the prison, and this would be the last time that Bob and Donny ever interacted. Although he was away from the houses where all of the craziness had happened, Donny knew there was something inside of him now that lingered. Stories had spread about what happened over the weekend, and the prison guards and other inmates stayed away from Donny. They could see there was something different about him. He carried a feeling of dread and uncertainty with him wherever he went. It was at this point that Donny started to understand his newfound abilities. He started to feel that he can control the power that resided inside him. He could make it rain. Donny Decker now believed he could control the rain, and other people in the jail could feel it as well. The warden could feel this supernatural presence emanating from Donny, and he kept a close eye on him. While he had been a rather quiet and innocuous prisoner before, Donny was now the center of attention in the prison, and it wasn't long before it started raining in Donny's cell. Just as it had happened in the Kiefer household, it started happening all over the prison. Water would fall from the ceiling, rise from the floor, and fly in every direction during those indoor storms. The other inmates grew confused and scared as to how this was happening. No one had an answer. Donny's cellmates started yelling at Donny, demanding answers just as women had done a few days earlier. The cellmate, now terrified of what Donny could do, wanted to be removed from Donny's cell, where the unexplainable rain thundered down on the two men. The warden decided it would be smart to move Donny into a more secure cell in the main cell block. As he was being prepared to move into his new cell, the guards decided to have some fun with Donny. They had heard about his so-called powers and decided to tease him. They asked him if he could hit the warden with a raindrop from where he was, and he said, "I'll try." The men scoffed at Donny's response and continuing to mock him until something would happen with the rain. Donny had already felt greater control over his strange abilities, and even though he knew the guards were making fun of him, he decided to honor their request. As you could expect in any prison, the prisoners had not had a love for the warden, and Donny would relish the experience to inconvenience the man who ran the prison that he was constricted to. Donny began to focus his thoughts on the warden. He concentrated and pictured the warden eating in the brick room. As his mind grew more focused, he started snapping, and with every snap, a drop of rain materialized in the break room and hit the warden. After a few snaps, the warden looked down at his wet shirt, and he knew right away that Donny Decker was behind this. Although he knew that Donny was behind it, he couldn't understand how. Donny was several locked doors away from the warden. There was no way that Donny could have hit him. It was physically impossible. Donny could not have hit the warden without the help of some other worldly presence. The warden went to check on Donny, and when he saw him sitting quietly in his cell, he knew there was something wrong with him. The warden knew that Don was possessed. He didn't have physical proof or any evidence, but he could feel deep down there was something malicious inside Donny. The warden thought about what he should do in this situation. He had never had to deal with anything remotely this strange before, and he was unsure of what could be done. He had already had Donny moved to a different cell and was closely monitoring him. The warden was a religious man and decided he would have to go through religious means to cure the boy of what he thought was inside of him. As the warden weighed the option in his head, the others around Donny were growing more and more unnerved by the minute. Those people in prison that interacted with Donny said they felt sick to their stomachs just being around him. There was this universal feeling of uncertainty and uncomfortability that came with Donny Decker. This boy, who had once messed around with the wrong crowd, was now associating himself with something far worse than any common thief or thug. The warden didn't even want to look at him. He didn't want to be around him, and knew that nobody could fix this problem except a minister. The warden decided to arrange an exorcism to hopefully cure the boy of the presence that had put the entire prison staff on edge. The practice of performing exorcism can be somewhat controversial. Many organized religions refuse to perform them without extensive permissions and evidence of a possession. There have been several cases of exorcisms performed that have had disastrous effects on the afflicted individual. While the warden knew that organizing an exorcism for one of his prisoners would be controversial and unorthodox, he felt that it was the only thing that could rid Donny of the spirit that had taken hold inside of him. He called a local minister and prepared a room for the exorcism to be handled. They placed Donny in a common area outside the main cell block that they referred to as the closet. The jail chaplain arrived, armed with his Bible, holy water, and other tools commonly used in an exorcism. The chaplain first talked to Donny before the exorcism began, and he told him that he was going to perform an exorcism so that the bad spirit inside of Donny could be released from him. He said he was there to help, and that this was all for the salvation of Donny's soul. Donny sat in silence. He didn't make eye contact with the priest, and he waited for the ritual to begin. The warden watched anxiously as the priest entered Donny's cell. The priest took Donny's hand and started reading scriptures from the Bible. As the priest continued his convicted reading, a stench started to enter the cell. Donny described the smell as the scent of rotting flesh. As the horrible stench filled the cell, the priest remained steadfast in his effort to cure Donny of the force that was inside of him. And Donny started feeling something stir inside of him. He felt a sick feeling in his stomach and knew there was something wrong with whatever had taken hold of him. As the force inside of him writhed and struggled, he felt more and more uncomfortable. He didn't want the priest to stop, but he was having a hard time dealing with the pain inside of him. And soon after the smell had entered the room, it began raining. The mysterious rain that followed Donny wherever he was started forming in the air. This time, the rain took aim at the chaplain performing the exorcism. The rain swirled around the room, pelted the priest as he continued to read from his holy book. Donny had never seen the rain as intense as it was during this very moment. As he looked at the soaking wet priest and then at the book in his hands, Donny noticed that the rain would not hit the Bible. This peculiar aversion caught Donny's attention as he sat in silence. Donny was no longer in control of the rain. He wasn't commanding it as he had done so when he soaked the warden. He had never seen the rain act this way before, and he was curious as to how the book remained dry in the presence of all this chaos in this rainy room. The priest was talking very loudly at this point. It commanded the demon to go back to the pits of hell where it belonged. And the odor in the room intensified, and Donny smelled death. As the exorcism continued, the turmoil inside Donny intensified. With every word, the priest said, Donny could feel something writhing within himself. He held on to every breath that he breathed as the priest continued his chant. The forces inside Donny were restless, and even though he had previously embraced his abilities, Donny was ready to break free from whatever was inside of him. After a few minutes, the priest commanded the spirit to leave the body of the boy, and Donny let out a shout. The guards standing outside the door readied themselves to subdue Donny if things were not going as according to plan. As Donny's cries had subsided, the chaplain called out to the guards. He demanded to be let out of the room. His work was done, and he was ready to leave. Donny opened his eyes and hoped that it was all over. He could feel a calm enter him that he had not felt in weeks, as the dark feelings that he had grown so accustomed to had subsided. He let out a gasp of relief. The spirit was gone, and Donny Decker was free. The warden called the exorcism a success, and the prison was put at ease with the mysterious case of the inexplicable rain. The warden thanked the chaplain, and the guards escorted Donny back to his cell in the main cell block. Donny was quiet the whole way back, and he would be back to his usual self for the rest of his time in prison. It had been 39 years since Donny Decker experienced these unexplainable ordeals. He claims that nothing like this had ever happened since, and he was free from the forces inside of him, and he hasn't seen any of the mysterious rain since the exorcism. Donny finished his prison sentence and lived a rather innocuous life afterwards. He still maintains to this day that the spirit that possessed him was his grandfather. Fast forward to 2012, and Donny was arrested and charged with arson. He turned himself in after a restaurant was set on fire in his home state of Pennsylvania. It is unknown why Donny decided to return to a life of crime 30 years after his initial arrest, but that is for him to answer for. The story of Donny Decker has cemented itself in paranormal history. He is often referred to as the Rain Man for his unexplainable ability to make it rain indoors. He was a part of history, and his story remains a shocking example of the power of lingering memories. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to go ahead and slap that like button. Also, leave a comment down below. And if you're new to the channel, be sure to go ahead and hit that subscribe button and keep your notifications on for every new episode I release. As always, guys, I got a ton of great content coming your way. I can't wait to show you. I'll see you guys in the next episode.